So, good morning, everyone. This is a talk this is a new set of slides and new slide deck. I have put together. There are a lot of slides in it. If you want to take photos, I would get your camera out now and keep it out, simply because there are a lot of them. The last time I checked, there were 177 slides. It's going to go quick. Right. I don't like the word serverless. Just so we're all clear, we're at a conference with the word serverless in it, but that's fine, because I also think it should have been called Jeff. If you don't understand that joke, please go and look up the blog. There was another word that I don't particularly like as well. It's cloud. Cloud is a terrible name for what we actually use. The cloud is a thing that many people don't really have a good definition for, but we're also stuck with that, and it's been around for a while. And kind of we have to go with that now. We all kind of think we know what the cloud means. And so, lots of people now use the word cloud for things. So now we're kind of stuck with the word serverless, aren't we? Well, kind of are we? Are we? Let's kind of go into that. But first, I'll kind of give you a little bit of background about me. It's already been said, I've been CTO of a number of startups. I have written a bunch of blogs that people seem to like. I keep on getting told they're good, so I keep writing them. I also started a conference called JeffConf, which people told me was a bad name for a conference because nobody knew who Jeff was. And why did I have to start a conference with a man's name in it? So we changed the name to Serverless Days. And then I also was, as has been said, the senior developer advocate for serverless at AWS for a relatively short period. I've also been a CTO. I'm now an interim CTO. I do advisory work, due diligence on startups. I also am a climate activist. I spend some of my time going around talking to lots of tech people about the impact of tech on the climate. And I'm also a director of a community energy company. So I have lots of different areas that I work in, but I also talk about serverless and still find this area really fascinating. And if you want to get hold of me, that's all my details. Please shout. Take a picture, come find me. And the thing is, have you noticed, and I'm not sure if you have, well, actually you would have done, every time there is an online discussion about serverless, every single time, they're all the same jokes. And I'm pretty sure there's one that you will know every single time, which is, there are servers in serverless. Has anyone never heard this joke? Anyone? Anyone want to say, put their hand up? No? You've all heard the same joke. And it's exactly the same joke as when cloud happened, which is that it's someone else's server. They're pretty much the same joke. It's like they're regurgitating the joke again. It's like essentially people that don't use cloud just want to talk about the fact that actually there's some technology there that we all use anyway, and it's just, oh, isn't it funny? We'll just kind of have a joke at someone else's expense. It's like the tech community has no creativity in the way that we make jokes about other people, just kind of saying. But why do we have these jokes? What is it about the community? Why do we do that? Why do we seek to kind of bring other people down when they're actually doing something quite creative and interesting and new? Well, there's a bit of a because in all of this. It's because we actually have no accepted definition of serverless. And actually, when you think about it, we have no accepted definition of cloud either. And that's quite important to say. I've been to a number of talks already at this conference, and people have used the word serverless. One of the things that's quite important is that nobody has defined it. So why does this matter? I think it's quite an important thing to point out, actually, because what actually happens online is we all have a massive fight about the word serverless. And, it's quite an enjoyable conversation to have. It's like you don't say the same things I say, and, you talk about serverless in this way, and I talk about serverless in that way. And, you end up with this. You keep using the word serverless, and I do not think it means what you think it means. And that's pretty much what happens, because people don't talk about the same things. And actually, when someone says, oh, that's not serverless, or, oh, what you're talking about is never going to be serverless, or this is serverless and you're wrong, which is, and I have to say, I do talk about that in some ways online. It's because we're trying to figure out what this whole movement is all about. And I think it's actually quite an important discussion to have. And the thing is that everybody comes up with their own definition. Lots of people do. I do. And I think it's worth kind of having a look at those definitions. I think it's worth talking about where people are coming from, the kinds of things that we're hearing. And actually people will, within this room will say, well, I agree with this definition and I don't agree with that definition. So let's kind of have a look at some possible definitions. One of the first definitions that probably most of you will think of is anything that looks like function as a service. So we've got Lambda, your Google Cloud Functions, your Azure functions. They're all kind of obvious candidates for what serverless is. And that's kind of the given. Most people think about serverless in that way, or certainly the initial first time you look at it will be that way. Or, as is often the case, it's that framework. The one that we all know is called the serverless framework, which I have to say is very good. But that's not serverless, that's the serverless framework. You've got to kind of put the two words together and that's that. But it also then confuses a lot of people when they say, that's not serverless, that's just the serverless framework. It's like the two words, it's quite confusing at times. And then it can be anything that runs function as a service. Some people think that that's what it means. So, you've got your OpenFast or your OpenWhisk or your FM project or all of these things that are platforms that allow you to run functions. And then you've got, those people who just go, all right, it's just function as a service. That's what it is. And it's like, and big spoiler here, it's not. Or at least, in my opinion, it's not. And I think there's some very good reasons for that, which we'll get into a bit later. And just to kind of, as a big thing, to kind of just say right now, not all function as a service services are equal, because not all clouds are equal. They are not all the same. Anyone that's trying to build multi-cloud systems will tell you that instances on one cloud are not the same as instances on another. Functions on one cloud are not the same as functions on another. You can't just lift and shift from one to the other easily. It doesn't quite work that well. It's not impossible, it's just that they're not the same. And actually, the differences between functions across the clouds are actually much more than the differences between instances. So when someone says a function on one cloud is the same as a function on another, it's actually just wrong. There are some real nuances that you have to understand between them. Another definition, it's anything that runs on-demand compute. So I've heard a couple of people say, well, Google App Engine was the first serverless service, and I'm going to tell you that I think that's wrong as well. I think that was the first PaaS or something similar. We had our Herokus and all of that. I don't think that's serverless either. Well, maybe it's containers on demand, so something like Google Cloud Run or Fargate. And by the way, I love Google Cloud Run. I think that's an awesome piece of engineering, but it's not serverless, in my view, personal opinion. But does it scale to zero? That's my question. And then people go, oh, I know. I'm going to catch them out now. It's going to be on-demand containers that scale to zero. And then they sit there going, ha-ha, you can't get out of that one. And I just kind of sit there going, oh, every single marketing team in the world is trying to hook their technology onto the word serverless. That's what's going on at the minute. Everybody is trying to make sure that they ride the wave of this serverless word to make sure that they are part of this movement. And that's not being cynical, it's just good marketing. I know, I've been there. And that's quite exhausting for the rest of us who are trying to actually understand what the word means, because what you end up with is this movement and shift in what the word means. And over time, everything becomes serverless. And it's actually quite frustrating. Because what you actually just want is you want to sit in a hot tub and just ignore the whole world sometimes, a bit like Darth Vader here. And you end up kind of needing to kind of step away from the community and go, actually, this isn't quite how I want to do this. But the key point I'm trying to make here is what people are actually talking about is technology. They're not talking about something at a higher level. And I think this is because serverless is the wrong word. And I think the problem here is one part of this word, and it's the server bit of this word. Because everyone focuses on the server part. And I'd wish we'd had a word like cloud instead. I think we should have focused on the less part, not the server part. So what is serverless? What actually are we talking about when we talk about serverless? What is the broad conversation actually talking about? It's a completely different conversation. I think this is a good question. I think it's a better question to ask than just using the word and expecting everyone to think the same thing. It's not actually about technology. I don't think it's a technology question. I think it's much more of an approach. And it's an approach to the idea of how you do development. It's an approach to the idea of how you do business and use technology in that business. And I wrote a blog about this pretty recently, which was my 2020 edition of What is Serverless. I've written a number of What is Serverless blogs, and this supersedes them all. So if I disagree with myself from previously, don't take the previous ones, take this one. And I think that's quite important because sometimes we change our opinions and change our minds. So this is kind of my latest opinion, and this is why I think it's quite important. And why do I say it's an approach? There was a before serverless. And maybe it wasn't as good as serverless. But there was a before we had this word in our vocabulary. What did we do before we had serverless? Well, the first serverless conf was in 2016. Lambda was launched in 2014. Serverless as a word was actually first used in 2012, but it didn't come into common usage until late 2015, early 2016. That was roughly the time it became a word that we started to use. And I was a CTO well before the word serverless became a thing. And I was building a serverless startup before the word serverless was around. So what was I actually doing? If I was building a serverless startup before the word, how could I have been doing a serverless startup? That's a good question. I was obviously doing something, but I wasn't doing that. And it couldn't have been about technology. So what I was doing was, well, let's talk about the things I didn't want to do, because that's actually much easier. So the things I didn't want to do were things like SSHing into servers, upgrading them, monitoring them, checking for hacking attempts, and all the boring things that were actually really annoying. Because my background, 20 years ago, I started doing sysadmin work at a small data center at a university. And the first things I was doing was telnetting into servers. This was, a long time ago now, and having to deal with problems to do with, upgrading libraries from, I remember we had a custom version of Apache. Anyway, it's very, very bad life that was. But it was getting rid of all the boring things because managing servers becomes onerous over time and you need people to do it and it's a frustrating thing to do. So if you're a CTO, you don't choose to do these things. You choose to avoid them if you can. And that's a pragmatic viewpoint. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about trying to avoid doing work. It's not laziness, it's pragmatism, although I think it's laziness as well. But that's, being lazy is a good thing if you ask me in technology. Avoiding work over the long time. So being a startup CTO was actually really simple. Or at least the idea of it was simple. It was do as little as possible, move as fast as possible, and learn as much as possible for the business. And those are the three kind of things that I was trying to achieve as a CTO. Now, it might not seem, that means a lot, but if you start to dig into what that means, thinking about the technology, that does actually have some impact. Seems simple, but it's not when you start to think about it. So I did things like use API Gateway and Lambda, and I used single responsibility principle on my Lambda functions on purpose. And I used DynamoDB instead of using a relational database. And I used instances, didn't use instances or virtual machines or relational databases on purpose because they produce effort over time. You have to manage those things. And I chose to avoid that management. And there's one thing to say here. It would have been quicker with Django. I had previously built a number of startups and been involved with probably 8 or 9 startups where I had built the back end of all of this with Django. So I knew Django. I'd built teams. I'd run stuff. I'd been involved in all of that. I'm absolutely certain that I would have been able to build the system quicker with Django. But I chose not to. But it would only have been quicker for the initial build. Because that's all we ever actually really consider when we're building technology, is actually how quick do I get from start to finish of the initial build. We don't consider the longer term implications. How much does this take over the 5 years of the project? So let's go back to that checklist. Do as little as possible, move as fast as possible, learn as much as possible. How does that work? Well, if it's quicker with Django, what are we talking about? Moving as fast as possible at the start of a project is often a bad idea. And if you've never been in a startup, you probably haven't seen this. If you've been in a big organization, it probably doesn't matter whether you go fast or slow at the start because you've just got time and people and resources that you can bring in. But if you've been in a startup and you've reached that point where you go, oh my goodness, it's all gone wrong, you will realize that moving really fast at the start can often be terrible. Moving as fast as possible over the lifetime of a project is far more important. And so going slow and getting it right at the start can often be the way you make your runway last as long as possible in a startup. So I was building for speed over the whole project, and I was considering it and thinking about it all the way through. So my approach was allowing me to iterate very quickly, but it was slow to start with. And my approach also allowed me to avoid lots of maintenance headaches because I was considering them from the very start. And so everybody was happy. Even my CEO, he just let me go on with it. And the bonus was it also allowed me to avoid what often happens with startups, the big bang refactor or rewrite of version 2, when you all of a sudden realize that you've hit this point of, oh, we've realized we should have built this, and then customer comes, 3 more customers come along with new features, and the CEO says you've got to build this, and then you build those new features, and the CEO comes along, we've got 5 new customers, you need 4 more features, and those 3 ones that you built just then, they don't really matter either. And then you've just built this monolith that you don't really need. And so I felt like I was winning. But this was before the word serverless. And so this was my serverless. This checklist actually was my serverless. This do as little as possible, move as fast as possible, and learn as much as possible for the business. Oh, and there's one thing in all of this. Nothing on that list is technology-based. It's not about technology for me. It's never been about technology. Serverless is about the business. It's about understanding your role within the business. It's understanding your place to achieve business value by using technology. And I've been told off for saying that in tech conferences before. You can't say that. You've got to be talking about the technology. Well, actually, you've got to understand that you're a techie working in a business. Somewhere in there is business value. You are there to do something that produces some kind of value for your organization. If you don't understand that, you should probably be asking what you're doing. I'm a CTO. CTO is a business role. It's also a techie role, but it's a business role as well. And so my serverless is very focused on being a business role. Do as little as possible, move as fast as possible, learn as much as possible. So if serverless is about business, what is the definition that I use when I put it down as something that I can show to other people? So my serverless definition is this one. A serverless application is one that provides maximum business value over its application lifecycle and one that costs you nothing to run when nobody is using it, excluding data storage costs. It's quite kind of multiple elements to it, but it still fits with what we've just said. It might kind of feel like there are technology elements in there, but actually they're all business elements. Let's go through it. There's one thing to say in here. This definition doesn't stop you running servers. We're bothered about maximum business value at the first point of this. It may mean running servers, and there's a massive but coming here. It may mean running containers, and again, there's a massive but coming. Massive but. Maximum business value is most likely to mean function as a service for the compute layer. But why is that? Why are those two things so closely linked? And that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. By the way, this is an ongoing conversation between the two of us. I'm recognizing that you're asking me these questions without actually asking them, and I'm just kind of throwing them back at you. So it's actually relatively simple, because running servers is not very cost effective. And as an estimate of the systems that I've seen and the ways that I've seen function as a service used, around 95% is a relatively conservative estimate for the number of systems that I've seen could use serverless systems. So building with a function as a service compute layer and then a different data layer. And I'd say you could probably go towards 98% with relative ease, but 95 is a nice conservative estimate. And this is nothing to do with the type of application. When everyone says, I can't be long running, it can't be this, you can actually rewrite most applications to work with functions. It's everything to do with the total cost of ownership. Everything to do with the long-running elements of this and the business elements. Because we talk about the application lifecycle. That goes from deciding to do a project all the way to retiring the project and replacing it with something else. The actual build, which most techie people think about, is actually a very small part of that. The CTO is there thinking about the whole thing, and that's where I come in. I'm like, the build is like a small cost. The whole project, the 3 to 5 years it's going to be there, and the amount you're going to have to, the cost of replacing the project at the end of the day, that's a much, much bigger problem. Many people simply don't believe me when I say this. Even when I provide evidence. Now, Movivo, which was the startup that I was a CTO of, I was there for 2 years. We had a back-end team of 2. We had 500,000 monthly active users. We were using Lambda, we were using DynamoDB, API Gateway. We had an AWS bill of $300 a month. We were in 20 countries, 500,000 monthly active users. I don't know many startups that can do that for that little. And if we had no users, the whole thing would have just cost us very, very little apart from the storage costs, which weren't very much anyway. This is what we're talking about. I didn't say at any point that this was easier. I am not going to stand here and tell you that building serverless systems is easier than building your Django or your whatever it is you now build. I don't know, whatever the cool stuff is that some people go out and build. I'm not saying it's easier. And in lots of ways, building a bunch of microservices with Go and running your Kubernetes clusters may actually be easier because you've got lots of support and consultants and all of that. At least to start with, it might be. And over time, you could end up with things that look a little bit like this. And you've got your 6,000 instances and 1,500 microservices. And this is Monzo's picture, which they released last week, or earlier this week, I can't remember. And, fair play to them. They've automated a large proportion of this, and it's very clever. And I'm not saying this is bad. And I'm not having a go at them. I'm just saying that's what you get if you take a certain route and a different route forwards. It's just different. If you want to go down that route, fine, take that route. That's okay. What we're talking about is actually completely different. That could actually be serverless. It's possible. I don't think it is, and I don't know, without knowing their business model and understanding the way that they've built their business, whether it is or not. And that's actually the point. The reason I don't think it is because the last part of the definition I think is quite important. Is one that it costs you nothing to run when nobody's using it. I suspect Monzo doesn't scale to 0. That's why I don't think that's going to be the case. I suspect they don't try to call it serverless either. Point is, run the right tech for the business case you have. It's serverless if it scales to 0. That's what we're talking about. You can do that with servers. It's possible if you understand how to do it. You can even do that on-prem if you know what you're doing. It might take a little bit more effort and thought and understanding. It's much, much easier if you're doing it on the cloud with functions. Serverless is about mindset. And I still think I'm in the minority when I'm talking about this. I still think this is going to be a thing that I kind of bang on about for the next X number of years, and it'll take a while for everybody to catch up, because I still think we're going to be in the marketing phase of everyone's talking about lots of different things being serverless. And I think that will change, because I still think serverless is a shift in mindset for a lot of people. But once that shift has happened, we will be having this conversation in a different context. And the mindset shift will be away from technology towards business value. In a few years, we'll be having conversations about how using serverless has allowed us to do all of these clever things in our business, rather than here's some technology that allows you to be serverless. And I kind of started to write this in a blog in June. It didn't, it was a little bit clumsy as a blog, I think, but it was an interesting blog to write, and it kind of went somewhere. I think it's worth a read. Some elements in there of this are in there. It's worth a read. However, the future is what interests me. Where's this going? What are we going to be looking at? How are we going to be doing serverless? What does serverless look like in the future? Because the focus on technology has done something. It's made a lot of people with a lot of followers miss the possibilities. So people like Kelsey Hightower, who asks questions like, are there any good success stories where people have taken an old stack and made 100% serverless architecture? I think this misses the point. I think and I've had a number of conversations with him, I think he misses the point about what serverless is. He constantly talks about functions. He constantly talks about Kubernetes. And he constantly talks about functions as well. And it frustrates me because I try to explain that it's about mindset. I've got Jessie Frizzell as well. She has said, I mean, how production ready even is serverless? And I kind of want to put my hand up and go, it's been production ready for years if you know where to look. But it doesn't help when people with lots of followers say something like this, because lots of people then pile into their replies going, I know, it's terrible, isn't it? Who do these people think that they are? And then you get people from companies like iRobot saying, well, our production system runs serverless, and we've got like millions of robots. And then I try to put my response in as carefully measured way as possible, trying to say, I believe this, and so I say things like, the majority of workloads I've seen can easily be function as a service plus key value and document store. So I'm basically saying it's possible, and yes, we might still need some containers. And the killer comes when all we do is upload code, and the cloud works it out for us. I think that's where we're going. This is the future I see. All we do is upload code, and the cloud works it out for us. So what do I mean by that? It's not quite, I didn't quite put it in the way that I wanted. I don't really mean code in the way that most of us think about code. I'm not talking about auto-scaling. I'm not talking about on-demand compute. I'm not talking about things we already do with config, like resources. I'm not really talking about resource-based thinking, because that's what most people think of when we talk about config. Let's provision some resources. What do apps really need? They need compute, they need data layer or state, they need APIs and events, they need queues, they need configuration of components. I'm trying to stay away from resources. They need to basically work out what the resource graph is somehow, but not without talking about resources. Problem is, we don't have the words for all of this at the minute. It's a lot more than code or config. The problem is we don't know what this means. We don't know what these words are yet. Config is mostly about resources, not application. And the problem we have at the moment is that config is becoming application. And if you define how the application and its elements are related, and you use that in config, then everything starts to change. Your config and your code becomes something new. And the whole thing starts to fray at the edges. What if all you start to do is then define the shape of an application? What does that look like? And this is a great question. Could a cloud provider take that shape and model the most efficient resource setup? That becomes an interesting question. So you've got your application, you upload that defined shape, you don't define any resources, you don't say this, I need certain types of instance or function or anything else. You just say, this is how it works, here's the business logic, you figure it out. And the deployment is all done by the provider. You can even go one step further. What about, over time, they modify based upon the understanding of how your application works? So it could learn how best to provision the resources over time. So maybe after a bit of learning, it makes the DB a little bigger or the queues a little different, or maybe it changes based upon the usage. So at different times of the day or week, it changes. And if you had multiple applications like this, or components, maybe they could work together. Maybe the shape would change over time. And bear in mind, I'm using words that we don't have yet. This is just an idea. This is a concept. But they would be connected via an API interface of some description. And that API wouldn't necessarily have to be HTTP. It could be the most efficient way of communicating between the two. But there would be no resource management for you to do. That, you're getting rid of all of that. And this is where I think serverless may be heading. It's not no code, which I think is the most frustrating thing that someone says, oh, this is where we're going, it's no code. I think that's wrong. It's not serverless. There are servers, there are obviously servers, but they may run, they may not run. It doesn't matter, we're not worrying about them. It's removing the complexity of cloud. And this is really important because cloud removed the complexity of data centers. And I think that's what's happening. And it's removing the idea of compute being king. Because that's what cloud does. Cloud says we need to do compute, and we need to do it big. And that's what we talk about when we're talking about technology. We're like, oh, it's got to be about the compute. Serverless has to be about the compute. It's putting the focus back onto the business problems. It's putting the focus back onto, we need to do X. So we just build the app that does X. And the cloud provider does the clever bit and allows us to build a serverless application, which is what we want, or at least it's what I want. And we're not there yet because abstractions, it's a complicated thing to do, but I think we will get there. And we need things like a serverless app definition that doesn't have resources in it to be able to do that. And so things like we need to think about how compute and data layers and APIs and events and queues, and we need to define those without talking about resources. And building a definition without them is key. And we could do it. I think it's not straightforward. And then if we provide that to the cloud provider, they could automate the provisioning. And I do think that's something like this is the next iteration of cloud. That's what I think we're looking at. That's what I think serverless is. Which is why, in my opinion, that serverless is cloud 2.0. But I think there's a little bit more, a little bit of bonus content. We're nearly there. I just want to point out that all these fun pictures come from a guy called J.D. Hancock. So if you want to use them, they're all kind of free to use under Creative Commons. There's another reason I went with Lambda in 2015. And I think this is worth talking about. And it's around climate change. Now, maybe shift of focus a little bit, but I think it's worth talking about. On-demand compute was a really simple way to reduce our compute usage. When you run servers, you use electricity. Very simple. You are essentially turning something on and leaving it on. If you run your servers like that, absolutely fine. That's what most normal people do. I just immediately saw it as a way to not have to do that. And my immediate thought was, when it got announced in 2014, I was like, oh, that means I can run a system and I don't have to run a server the entire time. That will reduce my compute. And if you've never come across something called the waste hierarchy, something called reduce, reuse, recycle, most people actually spend all their time going, I know this because it's on recycling bins. Recycling is actually the worst bit of this cycle. The top one is the best. Reducing is actually the best part of the waste hierarchy. Reducing consumption is actually quite important. And actually, when I built the system, I was intentionally trying to reduce my consumption, intentionally trying to build a system that would reduce the electricity usage of my system. And I see my whole serverless mindset as being informed by reducing compute, and therefore trying to reduce my carbon footprint, or reduce the carbon footprint of the business. And it's partly why I don't see serverless as being about technology, but about mindset. It's informing all of this. Underneath, the ethics of my decision-making come back to why I chose this, why I use this idea. And the serverless mindset allows me to provide both high-quality solutions and reduce compute. This isn't just about a technology choice, which a lot of people seem to think it is. This is partly about my philosophy on life, which sounds like a bit of a heavy thing to say at this point in the morning, so I apologize, but it's I think it's important. And it may be, and I think it is, it's an imperfect gesture in an oil-based economy, but it's better than nothing. So that's why you now see me, if you look at my blogs and my tweets, I tweet a lot more about climate change than I ever did before, and I do a lot more talks, and I'm kind of shifting more towards talking about that than serverless. But if you want to know more, please get in touch. But I have written a blog about this. It's worth a read. It's called Fix Climate Change, Stop Being a Techie and Start Being a Human. And I think I've found that tech people have recognized that and seen that and been helped to understand the situation that we're in. I think it's worth a read. I'd appreciate it if you did, but don't worry if you don't. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. This has been a whistle-stop tour through serverless, why I think it's Cloud 2.0, and thank you for listening to the bit about climate change as well. So thank you very much.